will explain what we mean by the negative feedback mechanism. So what we need with a feedback mechanism, we have to understand three key points. Number one, I mentioned something about a set point. So we kind of have what's called a control center inside our body that's going to have these set points of all these different things. Now, a great example is going to be human body temperature. The set point is 98.6 degrees. Now, we know that sometimes that temperature can rise, and we know that sometimes that temperature can decline a little bit, but we always get back to that 98.6, and that's what this negative feedback system is. The other two parts are going to be what we call a receptor. Now, what we mean by a receptor is that a receptor found in our body will detect a change that will occur. So, for instance, if we're dealing with human body temperature, if we go outside and it's 100 degrees, obviously our body temperature will start to rise slightly because it is warm outside. It might be 100 degrees outside, and we can definitely feel that change. So those receptors will pick that up. The next thing is what we call an effector. And effectors are going to be structures that are found in the body that are going to help counteract what that change is. So let's say, for instance, if our body temperature is 98.6, we're very comfortable in the classroom right now, we walk outside and it's 100 degrees and we spend 5 minutes out in the direct sun, what will probably happen is we will all begin to sweat just a little bit because our body is detecting that change. So we have nerves and receptors that are detecting the change in temperature, and then what they will do is they will put the effectors into play, and those effectors are going to help us hopefully get back to that set point, which would be 98.6. So the effectors in this case would be the sweat glands. It would produce sweat, and as you know, when sweat is produced and that the watery material of the sweat evaporates, that helps cool the body, and hopefully, we can get down to that 98.6. Now, the one thing you have to understand about body temperature, that really only deals with, very minor changes in temperature, not extreme. If you jump into the Bering Sea and the water's at 33 degrees, it's going to be pretty tough for you to be able to get back to your 98.6 degrees. And, what happens when your body temperature declines is you start to shiver. You start to create some heat by shivering and creating some goosebumps that will produce some heat and hopefully warm you up to get back up to 98.6. But you can shiver all you want if you've fallen into the Bering Sea. Now, the other type of feedback mechanism is going to be what's called a positive feedback mechanism. And this is going to be very important, but it's very different than a negative feedback. Now, what happens with a positive feedback mechanism is this is where it will move conditions away from a normal state. So it's kind of similar to the negative feedback. There's going to be a change from the set point or the normal state. But what happens is that these type of changes are going to continue to go on and on and on until the desired result occurs. So an example would be blood clotting. So let's say we fall down and we scrape our arm and we get cut. Well, what happens is when you start to bleed outside of your body, you will stimulate what are called clotting mechanisms. So what happens is different chemicals will be produced in the body that will clot the blood, which will stop it from leaving the body, and it will continue to do that until that desired result of the blood leaving the body will stop. Another example of a positive feedback mechanism are in females when they're having a baby would be the uterine contractions. So when they're about to give birth and their uterus starts to contract, which we know as simply as contractions, they will start a certain distance apart, a time distance apart, but eventually they will become increasingly more frequent, and the contractions will be a lot more violent. Well, what happens is that they're going to continue to do it, these muscular contractions, until the desired result of the child leaving the mother and the actual act of childbirth occurring. So this is a very, very important concept. So it'll keep getting worse and worse and worse until the baby is born. So that would be an example of a negative feedback mechanism. So these are all important for this whole concept of homeostasis. So as we move through the class of human anatomy and physiology, we will discuss a lot of the negative and positive feedback mechanisms. I just gave you a few examples, and hopefully you understand if you go through some of the diagrams on page 7 and page 8, they kind of show you the whole entire process of how this negative feedback mechanism can work, whether things go too high or too low, and hopefully you get a little bit of an understanding. So this is the end of podcast number 1 on the intro to human anatomy and physiology, and I hope this was helpful.